Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The upcoming election, new parks opening, and the death of Phil Trineri. Tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, President and Executive Editor of the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by a roundtable of journalists, starting with Madeline Faber, editor of High Ground News. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Karanja Janaku is executive editor and associate publisher of the New Tri-State Defender. Thank you for being here again.
My pleasure.
Along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. We'll start with the election is not far away. Early voting starts October 17th. The actual election day is November 6th. And one of the big ticket races, Bill, is the governor's race. And there was a debate this last week between the Republican Bill Lee, the Democrat Karl Dean. What were your takeaways?
First general election debate between Lee and Dean, and I thought that the candidates stuck pretty close to what they've been saying on the campaign trail. Basically, Dean defining himself through his experience as being the mayor of Nashville, starting at the onset of the Great Recession and through its economic recovery, and Lee emphasizing his political outsider status and what he calls his executive experience running a company that has 1,200 employees in Franklin, Tennessee.
Karanja, your take, you were there?
I was there. I did take particular notice of where the candidates were on the issue of whether the TBI should be brought in on officer-involved shooting. Should they come in automatically, or should they wait to be called in? They had differences of opinion about that, with Mr. Dean thinking that transparency would be served by having them come in each time. And so I just thought that caught my eye. I also thought that from an African-American community standpoint that we would be able to talk to either one of these candidates, you know, if they were elected. The question is, where does the conversation start once you get in there? Because they do have some different positions on some things, vouchers and things of that sort.
Yeah, the voucher thing, education was highlighted, and some of the things I was out of town, unable to watch. Bill Lee is talking about vouchers. Memphis has been a center of education reform over the last 5 to 10 years. Do you hear people clamoring for vouchers? I mean, we've got charter schools, we've got school takeovers, we've got a lot of school choice now. Is the next step vouchers from what you hear and the people you interview?
I hear a divergence of opinion in all communities about it. But what I do hear in terms of a consensus is that we have to find a way to improve education. And these two candidates are both saying that. It's a question of what approach do you use.
Yeah. Bill, your take on education, they talked a little bit about the Achievement School District, which was formed to take over low-performing schools. It's been heavily involved in Memphis. There's been some amount of criticism that those schools that they've taken over really haven't particularly gotten off the bottom of the barrel. We had Dorsey Hobson on recently, the school superintendent. Your take on the differences on education, which has such an impact on Memphis?
The candidates were pretty much wait and see, and ASD, the Achievement School District, will change to some degree inevitably, was where they seemed to be on that. Lee brought up the innovation zone schools here in Shelby County schools that have outperformed the ASD schools so far, which I thought was pretty interesting. The voucher debate is an interesting one locally because, of course, Brian Kelsey, state senator from Germantown, is one of the most vocal advocates for a pretty broad voucher program. Here, Dorsey Hobson, the superintendent of Shelby County Schools, who is an adamant opponent of the voucher school system, actually came out the night of the debate in favor of Bill Lee, endorsing him for governor, the first time that he's made any kind of endorsement in a political race.
Does anyone think, I mean, the polls have Lee up by, polls are funky, but, as much as 9 to 15 points. I mean, does anyone think that's Dorsey Hobson trying to latch his his fate to the leading candidate? And I mean, is it just a strategic position? I don't know if you talked to Dorsey about the reasoning behind that.
We've reached out to him. He was out of town. We do want to hear from him. There are a lot of people in the community who want to know why he has taken that particular position.
I think that would be the simplest explanation for what is kind of a surprising and bold move. But he has said repeatedly that he's not angling to get a political position. But we'll have to wait and see on
Dorsey
that.
has, yeah. The other thing that came up was pre-K funding, which has been a big issue here. The city, I mean, universal pre-K. There were different approaches, and maybe I'll turn to you, Madeline. One, I think, if I remember right, from the accounts I read of the debate, Bill Lee talked about a lot of kind of programs outside government that would, privately funded, that would help with mentoring, would help with pre-K. I mean, your take on the communities you're in, that High Ground's in. The clamor or lack thereof for universal pre-K?
I think universal pre-K is essential in many of our Memphis neighborhoods, especially in helping children from disadvantaged communities get a leg up. We're also seeing nonprofits and private groups kind of step up to meet that need. We're working on a story now with High Ground News about an effort in Fraser to train up early childhood providers in a superior way to wrap around children who maybe have experienced adverse childhood experiences and need kind of particular care in helping them be educated and learn in a solid environment.
Your take on pre-K? It's an interesting debate from that. Mayor Strickland has made a big deal of it. The local philanthropic community has. The city council. I mean, everyone wants universal pre-K on some level. Virtually everyone. But then there are all these differences of how to fund it, how to do it, what is pre-K and what is quality pre-K.
To me, it's almost as if there is the state discussion about universal pre-K, and then there is the local debate within Memphis and Shelby County that is a completely different planet from the state discussion. We witnessed all of the Republican contenders for governor in the primary debate that was held here earlier this year say that they're absolutely opposed to universal pre-K. But then once they found out that a lot of their supporters in the audience for each candidate were intimately involved in the universal pre-K drive locally, they began to moderate their positions. Lee didn't come out and say he was opposed to it. He said that he preferred to work with faith-based organizations and had concerns about it being quality universal pre-K, which has always been part of the boilerplate of the approach to universal pre-K here locally. Dean said that he was for universal pre-K.
And there are lots of stats on kids who get pre-K. It's not universally accepted, but there's a lot of evidence, quality, whatever that means, high quality pre-K that will lead to kids reading better by 3rd and 4th grade. And I think it's Mayor Strickland and many others who use that as a kind of almost, I mean, they harp on it constantly, and perhaps rightly, that kids who are reading at level by 3rd and 4th grade go on to succeed at greater numbers than kids who fall behind early on. Your sense, Karanja, on this question of privately funded, philanthropically funded, or faith-based funded pre-K and the government getting involved?
Well, I'd like to see from the African American community more of a private move. We have to do both. But I think my main thing goes back to what Madeline is saying, is that I just really think this universal pre-K is just so essential. And while there are some varying reports, it does seem to be tied to people's ability to be able to learn to read, particularly on grade level by the time they get to the 3rd grade. And then when you look at crime and things of that sort, and you start to see a connection. I just think that we're going to have to put a different emphasis on our priorities relative to funding, and just bite the bullet on some things that we just have to move on. I just think universal pre-K is one of them.
We'll stay with schools for a second. And Bill, the list of priority schools was shuffled by the state, and several charter schools are going to be closing at the end of this academic year. Is that correct? This is a process the state goes through, I think, to some degree in conjunction with local government every year.
It's also a requirement that when this list is shuffled, and it's not shuffled every year, it's shuffled over the course of, I think, 3 years was the original plan. That hasn't always worked out, but in this case it did. So if they are on the priority list, which is the list of failing schools, the bottom 5% in the state, and they're charter school, then they automatically close under those particular provisions. The list was interesting because you also had some what are known as reward schools, high-performing schools, and you had a lot of those within the Shelby County school system who were new to the list and who maintained being on that list.
Maintain being on, you said they were reward school, so they were doing well or not?
They're doing well, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Move on. I jumped over one thing, which is, again, it is election season, and we had President Trump in town this past week. He was at a rally in South Haven. There's a somewhat competitive race. It's a strange year in Mississippi, normally not a particularly competitive state for Democrats versus Republicans. Obviously, we have the Bredesen-Blackburn race, which is very competitive in Tennessee. Thoughts from anyone on President Trump's visit here?
Well, the tack that we took was to go and see if we could find African Americans at the Trump rally, and we wanted to know what were they doing there. You know, what do you see from Mr. Trump? Not why are you a Republican? Why are you following Mr. Trump? You know, and what we found was a range of things. You know, from business opportunities to selling T-shirts to lining up with values. Particularly relative to things like gay marriage, immigration policy, and things of that sort.
Yeah, Madeline.
Well, I think we should all recognize that this rally made national headlines because of Trump openly mocking Dr. Ford's testimony last week, which was shocking and difficult for many of us to hear. But what I'm particularly worried about is the connection he made between one woman's statement about her sexual, assault, and then connecting that to the extremedness, he said, of the Democratic Party, and aligning those two things to sort of further throw fuel on his candidate and create some more distance.
Bill, your take.
This was the last rally in a series of rallies that day. The president is campaigning for candidates in the midterm election. He was in Johnson City campaigning for Marsha Blackburn. In Mississippi, he was campaigning for the interim senator there for that Mississippi Senate seat that was held by Thad Cochran. And he probably spent the least amount of time in his remarks on that particular Senate race. It was like everything that had been building up from the campaign trail that day and watching television, which we know that's where he gets most of his information, all of that came spilling out at the last rally of the day. And it really, in terms of his goal of promoting Republican candidates in the midterm election, you can look at it as it worked because he stirred up his base, he got his base going. You could also look at it as he cast a big spotlight on the Kavanaugh nomination at the expense of those congressional races in the midterm, and he may have stirred the pot with the Democratic base, who will react with outrage and come out and vote in larger numbers in November.
It's interesting to have a competitive race in Tennessee this year with Phil Bredesen, who was a former governor, a Democrat, known as more of a conservative Democrat, at this time running against a woman, Marsha Blackburn, a Republican who's been more on the right end of things. I think that's fair. I think she would agree with that. Thoughts about how Trump, just observations about how controversies around President Trump have influenced this statewide race?
I think that you have seen it embolden the Democratic response to it, the Democratic backlash from it, and I think that the Republican support for Trump and his policies has always been there, has been pretty consistent. This is a red state. It's been a red state for the last 18 years in terms of presidential politics. The question is how the Democrats were going to respond to it. Yeah. And were they going to respond to it in great enough numbers to affect elections? We know from our own local elections here, being one of the two blue dots in a red state, that there is a blue wave this year. We'll see in November, whether that translates statewide.
It was, what, 10 months ago, 10 months ago, we had Lee Mills, the Shelby County Republican Party head, and the head of the Democratic Party, local Democratic Party, Corey Strong. Corey Strong. And I remember very poignantly, it was right after the Doug Jones election, Democrat winning in Alabama over, what many people thought was a very flawed Republican candidate. A lot of accusations around him and so on. And Lee Mills said that, we are going to have to divorce ourselves from President Trump. I mean, those were his words. He was the head of the local Republican Party. And he talked about how educated, suburban, traditionally Republican voters were being turned off. At the same time, we're in a state, Tennessee, where President Trump has tremendous support, certainly in rural areas, and as well as in some parts of urban areas, certainly. But just this race, the Bredesen race, the kind of moderate tone he's taken, in some ways really speaks to this really severe urban and rural divide in Tennessee. True in many states, but thoughts on that?
It just seems prudent. I mean, Bill gave the numbers relative to where the state is. Marsha Blackburn is clearly putting all of her horses on the Trump road, and so Mr. Bredesen's being prudent about it, and so it's a fine line, though, whether or not you're going to be able to walk that way and then be able to, to get out that independent and Democratic base. But I think that the bill is right, that there is a blue wave, and I think there's a good reason to think that it's going to continue, at least in this part of the state.
Yeah. Any last thoughts on that? So we'll move on. One more thing on the ballot. Again, I mentioned early voting comes up October 17th. The election day is November 6th. Besides, we've got, statewide races for House and Senate. Am I right on that, Bill?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
We do. Some of those have been effectively determined. Many are effectively determined in the primaries. But besides the Senate race, the statewide Senate race between Bredesen and Blackburn, and the statewide governor's race, obviously, between Lee and Dean, we've got local charter amendments. And they include term limits for the expanding term limits from 2 terms to 3 terms for the city council and the mayor, and then some changes in instant runoff voting. We pre-taped a show that airs next week that goes very, very deep in the weeds on these issues, the wonkiest show ever done in the history behind the headlines, with Steve Mulroy and Martavius Jones, but they're complicated and really important issues. So maybe frame up those 3 charter amendments, because I do think sometimes those are the issues. People go into the voting booth, they know their candidate, they've seen the yard signs, they're voting on big ticket governor and Senate race, and then suddenly they're confronted with these seemingly wonky pieces of text about amending the charter in some somewhat cryptic fashion. So let's go through those 3.
And even under the best of circumstances, the wording on these things is technical, and it is very difficult to understand at best. So let's go with the simplest first. And that is, there is a city charter amendment that would extend the current term limits on the city council and mayor from 2 consecutive terms to 3 consecutive terms. And that would apply immediately, meaning that you have 3 city council members currently serving who are in their 2nd term who would be term limited if this fails. If this passes, they could run for a 3rd term in office in the 2019 city elections. Now, instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting. The question on the ballot is whether that should be repealed. Voters approved it in a 2008 city charter amendment. Instant runoff voting is where, instead of voting for the one candidate that you want to win an office, you go in and vote for your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. In some instances, you can go to 4th or 5th, or you can do none of them. You can still just vote for one. This affects the 7 single-member city council districts. It does not affect the other 6 super district council members. In those 7 single district council races, if no one gets 50% plus 1 of the votes, it goes to a runoff election in November for that particular district. Instant runoff voting would say, no, there's no runoff. What happens is nobody gets a majority. You go to the candidate who gets the least amounts of votes, and you look at the second choices on those ballots, and those votes are distributed up the ballot. You do that eliminating candidates by their low vote totals until you have a candidate who has the majority of the votes by that count. And the third measure Yes, there's a third measure. The third measure would simply eliminate the runoff provision in the city charter, would say that these 7 council seats are going to be treated like everything else in city and county government and state and federal government, and just say whoever gets the most votes in those races wins. No majority required.
Yeah. Thoughts on these charter amendments? I mean, they're really important. They're wonky. We kind of laugh about it because it's complicated, but they're very important to how people are elected, how long people serve, and the cost and complication of elections.
They are important, and we're going to start a series of stories here in the Tri-State Defender very soon to try to dewonk it, as you say. Maybe we'll get Bill Dries to help us out there. But isn't it mind-boggling to think that there was a passage of that instant runoff voting thing, and no one seems to, a lot of people to have no idea.
It was passed in 08 and it's never been done.
Of what it is, and it just speaks somewhat to the idea that we've just got to become more intelligent, generally speaking, relative to this and every issue. And I think that even gets back to our issue of education and being able to teach our students how to be critical thinkers about everything. And that gets back to Trump and all of that.
Yeah. We got 6 minutes left, and I want to touch quickly on parks. There are 2 things. The River Park, I think I'm saying that right, on the other side of the bridge is reopening, is that correct?
Actually, it's the Big River Levee Trails, which you need a permission from. This is 73 miles of gravel trails that are atop levees in Arkansas that the St. Francis Levee Board voted to reopen this month, and they will open it again starting in March. So quite a landscape out there.
Across the Harahan Bridge, the Big River Crossing.
It actually, yes, it starts in West Memphis and goes further.
And another section, Madeline, of the Wolf River Greenway, which ultimately will extend all the way from the Ghost River way out in Fayette County all the way to downtown. A section of that is open around Kennedy Park in North Memphis. You all are about to be writing about that or have just written about it.
Yeah, so this week the section of the Wolf River Green Line opened in Kennedy Park, and next week the section at Epping Way will open. That's 2.5 miles altogether. I love that we're seeing the Greenway extend into Memphis neighborhoods. I think that pedestrian paths can only be helpful in increasing property values and decreasing crime, in that you have kind of a public area that's flush with people and lights. I hope that we see further development of the Green Line into Memphis neighborhoods. I know that the Heights is working on developing what it's calling the Heights Line along National Street, which would ultimately connect to the Green Line.
Where are the Heights, for people not familiar with that neighborhood?
So the Heights Line would connect at Chelsea with the Green Line, and this would stretch from Summer and Bayless.
To the Wolf River Greenway,
yes.
Not the Green Line. Yeah, just so we're
Wolf River Greenway.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, Shelby Park Green Line, yes, to the Wolf River Greenway. So the Heights is our current neighborhood that we're focusing on, and that's sort of the neighborhoods that surround Summer Avenue.
And we've seen, this was a part, it's a $60 million project, this Greenway, Wolf River Greenway, that it would be built in sections. And I remember when they were raising the money and when they were talking about it in the early stories we did back at the Daily News and on the show, they talked a lot about it was important to be in every neighborhood, and that hopefully that would spread the wealth of public access, not just to the Poplar Corridor, but to all of Memphis. Your thoughts?
Well, it's important, I think, to get into every neighborhood, but it's also important that when you're doing the construction and things to bring this about, that the wealth opportunities are spread around. And one of the stories that we've done relative to, or getting ready to do relative to Epping Way, is just sort of looking at minority contracting involvement in the process.
Yeah. A sad note to end on, Phil Trineri, who was the CEO of the Memphis Chamber, formerly headed up Pinnacle Airlines, was killed I guess a week ago now. And it was shocking and sad for a lot of people. You talk about parks, you talk about the Green Line, the Chamber of Commerce under Phil's leadership had put a big priority on greenways and green spaces. I'm, full disclosure, we are a member of the Chamber, and I had worked on some of that stuff with Phil and gotten to know him. It was horrifying to have a prominent person shot in what looks like a very senseless killing, a very random shooting. Thoughts with just a couple minutes left, Bill?
Well,
And I should note before, I'm sorry, I started to cut you off. And I should note that in the context of that is that since in the time around Phil was killed, he was one of 8, maybe 10 homicides in Memphis. And a lot of prominence put on this because Phil touched and was known by a lot of people, but I don't want to brush over the fact that there were a lot of senseless murders in that same time frame. Go ahead.
Right, and that is the context of this. I think in a way Phil's death calls even more attention to the general problem of violence in our community, because it highlights that this is not a problem that is about one part of town. This is a problem for all of us that we all need to talk about more, and not just talk about it when it's someone prominent, but talk about this and work toward it when it's someone that we've never heard of before.
Karanja.
It was around the corner when it happened, and Bill and I met out there on the scene. It's horrifying on multiple levels, you know. And then when you look at the young people that are accused of it, I really think we have to look hard at their backgrounds and just how did we get to this point.
Yeah, it's accused, 16-year-old, 18-year-old, and 22. Madeline, thoughts?
Well, just to touch on the point most immediately, I think we should be watching the criminal justice process in this, especially the 16-year-old who was in the car, possibly being tried as an adult. But I think that, you know, Phil Trineri was such a light to Memphis and improved us in so many ways, and I think we could honor his life and his work by not being afraid to walk downtown and continue to support the businesses that he supported.
Yeah, Phil walked, if you knew Phil, and Phil was a friend, not a close friend, but a friend of mine. He walked everywhere people knew him to walk. He took bird scooters around. He was 64 when he passed away, and he believed intensely in this city, and it was very genuine. Public, you would think a chamber president would say that publicly because that's their job. Phil said it privately. He said it, everything he saw, whether or not you agreed with what the chamber did, he sought to make Memphis of all stripes better. And he was really a very inspirational guy on that front to me in terms of his commitment. He was a guy who could have been doing a lot of other things and chose to commit himself to Memphis. We leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. We'll sit tight.